by the time Christmas was nearly there, they were all sold out. Now, it happened that all this while I was working on the second series.
How was that feeling to know that they were successful on that?
Was
go to the store and see them?
Oh, you better believe I went to the store and saw them. Yeah, come on, what a thrill that was to see them. And they were on these racks with this header piece and posters in all the windows. Well, that poster that we were looking at before was in store windows on the glass at the front of the store. I mean, it was really done right, and it was a wonderful, wonderful success. Except, well, then it all fell apart overnight. No. Well, meanwhile, I'd been working on the second series. So the second series, by the time these were out, the second series was ready to go, literally. And the second series, I didn't refer to Famous Monsters of Filmland. I just made it about myself. I gained the confidence. That little taste of success was all I needed to enable me to do the next lot on my own, essentially. Although there were echoes of this genie from the Son of Sinbad or something like that, but you know. But you have to understand that I felt I'd earned these monsters because I had sat through so many rotten horror movies. In the worst of the horror movie days, when what you saw at the last 30 seconds of the film was some guy with a can of Campbell's vegetable soup thrown on his head, or something so perfectly awful, that I felt like I'd really earned the right to use these things. And I knew that Famous Monsters of Filmland was the one place where you saw one photo of that, if you were lucky, of that creature from that movie. But you couldn't go in a toy store and see them or buy them or, you know, or find them anywhere else. They weren't even pictured in books yet. Monsters weren't that hot. There was one little French book that showed monsters, which I owned at that point, but which I bought in France. But so I thought it was quite all right to borrow these images, and I thought I had really enhanced them and made them into what they were. But the second series, I didn't have to do that, and they were all quite original. So this guy, Commander Comet, he got a guy who was more diabolical. This one, which is all I have left of him. This one, you know, this was so cutting edge. It was years, not only was it years before action figures appeared, it was many years later before they did anything. The second series all did something. They lit up, they all had features. 10 years later, it was like Kenner that started to show features in action figures in a Ghostbusters series. But nobody ever had features. To me,
He-Man had that twist, that turning head, or Two-Face, I think his name.
Yeah, but that was years after this guy.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Years after this. I'm not going to say it was directly inspired by this because nobody ever saw this. This second series didn't see the light of day.
Really? It never was produced?
It was produced to the point that the final production models came to us. There were like 24 sets of them.
Oh, wow.
Just like that thing on Star Wars. There were like 24 sets of these things. And they were ready to go in production. And the other set was in the stores. It's flying off the shelves. It's selling like crazy.
Series 1.
Series 1, but it was mostly in the metropolitan New York area. I don't think other parts of the country got them to the degree that they were distributed here. And then they landed on the moon. I think it was July or something like that. And when they got there and there was nothing there, the whole world lost interest in space. I mean, it was just dead. Matt Mason was dead. Space was over. The expression that ricocheted through the toy industry is, space is a dirty word. anything space had suddenly become poison. That didn't affect us because our shipment was sold out. But as for doing more, it's amazing. By the time the second moon landing took place, no one was looking at it. No one gave a damn anymore. But that wasn't that. Well, we immediately panicked, and so we renamed the second series. They were no longer the Outer Spaceman Series 2 or Outer Spaceman Continued. We named them The World of the Future in an attempt to not look like space. But the thing that really killed the whole thing is that the Outer Spacemen were on the water coming for Christmas, and there was a boat strike that lasted 4 months. And they didn't arrive here until the following year. They missed the Christmas season totally. And by that time, we were already looking at closing them out. And so when we walked through the front door of this house, thinking we were going to, I spent all the $15,000 that they had earned me on the down payment on this house, which was half the cost of the house. But we walked on we were entering the front door, the Outer Spacemen were terminated. They were ending. And I was stuck up here in the country in this world's biggest fixer-upper with absolutely no money to fix it up with. And Colorforms started the clock again, $200 a week. And that we started from ground zero all over again.
So what happened with Series 2?
Series 2, you have to understand that the folks at Colorforms hated the Outer Spacemen.
Even though they're probably one of the best-selling.
Hated them.
Why would that make sense?
More work for them. This was just Harry to them was the world's, they regarded Harry like he was a madman. And everything he did was a pain in the ass. And they couldn't wait to kill the Outer Spacemen. So the controller, he simply said, no, Harry, you can't do anymore. They're not selling spaces and selling, you're not doing them. And so they just killed him.
Wow.
That was the end of them. And years later, Harry saw that suddenly action figures were everywhere. And he said, what about our Outer Spacemen? What about our Series 2? And by this time, Harry could go out, and he got the sales manager, who was
How many years later?
about 6 years, 7 years later. By this time, Mego figures had advanced to the point that they even had action figures of the Waltons.
Oh, jeez.
So, I mean, there were lots of action figures by then. They starting about 5 years after the Outer Spacemen. It was a long space before they did any action figures. And the irony is, the little bit that Harry knew about space and science fiction, frozen in his head, was Buck Rogers. So he wanted to do Buck Rogers. And if the Outer Spacemen had continued, well, the next thing was going to be Buck Rogers. I wanted to do superheroes, all of them, Batman, Superman, all those. I was going to do that. It would have, everybody's life would have been dramatically different. The world would have been dramatically different. Instead, that was it. And I never looked back, and I never gave them a thought again for another 30 years.
So 6 years later, he did say, go ahead with Series 2?
Oh, 6 years later, he insisted. The sales manager said, we can't sell these. Harry says, I want to prove it to me. He says, I want to try. So Harry and I and the sales manager went out to the jobbers, Greenman Brothers, another guy in Manhattan, and the jobber says, these are great, but we have too many action figures already.
Series 2 never came out?
Never came out.
Not even with the Four Horsemen?
Oh, with the Four Horsemen they came out.
Yeah.
We're into, we're beyond Series 2. But the Four Horsemen realized Series 2 perfectly. They did a perfect realization of them.
The original
ones were here. These were.
They never came out.
No.
Wow.
Here's the one I have left. This all lit up. This was it. This is the only one that's left after this thief stole them all from this drawer, cleaned the drawer out. No, the Outer Spacemen saga for me ended very, very badly when someone came and stole every one that I had in this drawer, left a few pieces. In such a hurry to scoop them up, he left a few dregs behind.
But luckily Gary has Series 1 and Series 2.
Gary's got examples of all of them, and in this day and age, they could be repeated because one can simply do laser scans, duplicate them exactly.
I'm surprised that the Four Horsemen didn't take the exact what you had and went and go with that, where they wanted to kind of modernize it, I guess, with the size.
Well, they didn't know what to, they wanted to license it. They didn't know what to do with it exactly. I wanted to make figures that were even bigger than the originals, and they didn't know how to handle it. And then it was Matt Dowdy who really made this whole thing happen. And Matt Dowdy has this thing called Glios. And you know, this is this plug-in system where you can plug them all in and build your own things. Okay. And it was the Glios system which was where they finally clicked at what they wanted to do with these. And working with the Four Horsemen was very, very difficult. Difficult for me, difficult for them. Like I said, they'd never been criticized by anybody in their entire life. And I would come up with corrections, and the way I would word them insulted their delicate sensibilities. And the first two figures were fine. They came up with a Commander Comet that was so awful. It looked like Judge Napolitano. And the way I wrote it up rubbed them the wrong way. And so they simply stopped for 7 months. They stopped out of spite.
And Gary.
Oh, Gary, okay. Now then, Gary. Then I'm crazy for collecting. By that time, I was already working with Kisscom and whatever, or Harry or somebody. I was really into collecting. That was everything. And the way I worked with color forms, all the while I filled their line with everything, some 50 products a year, and they were all ready to run, and they were always on time. Then that was fine. They didn't care what I did, so I could go to every flea market, every show. Never had to miss a day of a single thing. For a week at Brimfield 3 times a summer, week at Atlantic City twice a year. I mean, it was at every one of them every day with my buddy Noel Barrett, basically. So at Atlantic City show, I used to share Noel's booth so I could get in early. He called me a helper. But the son of a bitch who ran the show, who was a real tyrannical Nazi, he caught Noel out on this and told me I had to have my own booth. So, okay, I end up getting a booth next to Noel. I have to set it up and put something in there to look like I'm actually a dealer. So I'm looking for crap to put in my booth, and I'm not the least interested in selling anything. I'm only interested in getting in the show for the 3 setup days to be able to pick the show, which I did outrageously. So I brought a set of Outer Spacemen. And it was Gary, who just had 2 twins with a double stroller, and his very attractive wife wandered into my booth, and Gary went batshit when he saw them. And
so he remembered them from his childhood.
He did, yeah. Remembered them very, very fondly from a very, very horrible childhood. He really did have one terrible, dreadful childhood. And his father passed away when he was really, really young. So Gary found the Outer Spaceman, and a year later he was back, and he wanted to buy a set, and I still had them, of course.
This was Series 1.
Series 1 and Series 2. I had
You're selling the...
I had an extra set of Series 2.
These were just one of the 24? Or was
Yeah, I had about 3 sets at that point.
Okay, 3 sets of the 24?
Yeah. Gary got the 2 sets, and over the years, the Outer Spacemen literally took over his life, and they became the thing that drove him, really. And it was thanks to that meeting and thanks to Gary that all of this has happened, and that all of this has happened, and that they're known to today. That otherwise, the whole world would have forgotten them, just as I myself had done. It would have ended right then and there.
How did he connect with the Four Horsemen?
He became an avid collector of outer spacemen, and he was determined to see it become a movie property. And he insisted on doing a graphic novel, and he would show me one script after another, and one after another was atrocious. And I would throw it back at him and say, Gary, this is horrible. And then he started showing me artist's work. Well, first of all, the guys that he was getting to write these scripts happened to also been his personal trainer in the gymnasium. And then he's showing me artwork and the characters in the artwork. They're abysmal. They're abysmal. And they turn out they were done by some bartender that he met in a bar. And I mean, they were so horrible you can't imagine. They looked like the kind of drawings that girls in high school. I have an example of them somewhere buried in my computer. They look like the kind of drawings that girls in high school would do in their borders of their books. Usually horses. They were horrible. And then one day, Gary up and shows me this artwork, which is really quite fabulous.
Artwork is sculpture or?
No, drawings. He shows me this really fabulous looking renditions of Colossus Rex and whatever. I said, Gary, these are amazing. Now you're cooking. He says, well, I'm going to get this guy to do some trial story. Just to test him, I'm going to give him that story that you read. That story's horrible. Well, Gary put his foot down and said, no, I'm doing it. And he published this graphic novel. And if the story didn't suck, it would have been decent. And the guy who turned out to be his personal trainer turned out to be a nice guy. Here's this almost good graphic novel. So Gary set up at the Comic-Con basically to peddle his graphic novel, and he had his impressive then collection of outer spacemen, because I continued to sell him stuff, and he paid very good prices for it, and clearly he was the person that I chose to continue this tradition. Okay. Well, along came the Four Horsemen and expressed some interest in licensing it.
To him, to you?
To Gary. They saw Gary's thing on there.
At the show?
At the show. And Gary didn't know how to handle it or whatever. I said, okay, Gary, I'll handle it. I'll take care of it. And so I became the person who dealt with the Four Horsemen. And they took on the license and offered us a very decent royalty. Not that in those limited editions it amounts to any money really, but it was a way of seeing them continue.
So series 2 comes out, and how many series?
No, it wasn't series 2. No, they were determined to do series 1 and series 2, so they marketed it in a very interesting way. They could only do 2 figures every 6 months or something. It's well not for 5 years. They could only do 2 figures every so often. And so they always chose one from Series 1 and one from Series 2.
That's a good idea.
So the last one they ever did was Colossus Rex. By this time, our relationship was so strained with them that they weren't going to do it. And it was really Matt Dowdy who stepped in and saved the whole project. Mm-hmm. It was Matt who saw this thing happen from the start to the finish. Because the Four Horsemen just had it with me. They didn't want, they couldn't take my criticism. And what really bothered them was that my corrections were always dead on right. And so it became a very painful thing for Eric personally. He'd expressed that he was feeling lack of confidence because he would think he was doing something great, and I would do intricately overlay after overlay. Well, many of them are online, but tracings, taking his and making corrections. And then I learned that I could do, on computer, I could do photographs they would send me. They're sending me the whole thing via photographs. I could take the photographs and cut and paste and make before and after photographs as a guide for. So in the end, I was practically sculpting it over the computer. Mm-hmm. And there were lots of strained times, lots of dead time in which nothing was happening.
But eventually they got all Series 1 answers?
Eventually they got them all and all these other variations. And it was Gary who picked up when then they did something that ended the whole project. I could have continued with them onward and onward because I had a whole series of 13 more figures in mind. Mm-hmm. And I would have gone right on
Series 3.
Series 3.
Yeah.
And simple as falling off a log. But it seems that Eric, when he grew up, he liked something called Power Lords, which was this action figure that came about 15 years after the Outer Spacemen. And it consists of a guy who's got two thumbs on every hand, and he flips around bare-chested. One side looks like a normal guy, and the other side, switch the arms around, see the other thumb is on the top, and he got his body is covered in blue veins.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and Eric liked that. So they took on that license too. And I lost it. I said, you don't do this. Having been in the toy industry and knew this, even in the cutthroat toy industry, there's a kind of ethic. And Masters of the Universe does not take on someone else's competing line of action figures. They simply don't do it. You don't do that. So here you got the Four Horsemen, who are licensed by us to do a series of outer space action figures, and now they're bringing into their line another competing set of outer space action figures, rather than realizing the potential of where ours could go. So that really was the cutoff point for me, and it was Matt Dowdy who stepped in and convinced them to at least finish with Colossus Rex. And
so did the series ever go to Series 3?
no, never happened.
No new sculptors or anything?
No. But with Gary, he continued to bring out more figures. So we did a lot of new figures. We did these women and Cara Firma and Jack Asteroid and
Who did you do those with?
Four Horsemen.
So they did continue to do
Well, they continued, but it wasn't on their steam. It was Gary paying for all these things.
So
Gary
they were dealing with you, they were dealing with Gary.
Well, they were dealing with me creatively, but with Gary in terms of placing the orders, all through Matt Dowdy. So Matt was the peacemaker in this.
So there kind of was a Series 3.
Well, there was a continuation of the Outer Spacemen, but I wouldn't.
How many new figures?
Well, see, they weren't new figures. That's the point. This is this with a new head on it.
Right. But I mean, like the female, was there a female?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Was?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
You're not familiar with her?
Not up to Gary's level of my knowledge.
Seriously? Was there a female?
This is the new one.
Yeah, you bet there's a female.
What was this one based on?
This is based upon my new drawings.
Well, that's what I'm saying. These aren't Series 1 and Series 2.
I wouldn't call these Series 3. Series 3, if I'd done Series 3, it would have been 13 figures.
Right.
They would have been based upon the characters of the Zodiac.
Okay.
There would have been like a bear who would be called Ursus Major.
Okay.
Or Major Ursus, excuse me.
Well,
and
as far as new figures, how many new figures came out about?
Well, they weren't entirely new figures, you see. There was a female body, and then we stretched that out to 1, 2, 3, 3, maybe 4 figures. There was, and then we adapted the existing male body with a few new heads and squeezed out a few more figures.
Okay.
But I would never call that series, never call them Series 3. They were just just an extension, a way, because I was always limited to some simple single point, some part.
So there wasn't the creativity that you originally had.
Well, there wasn't the freedom of creativity. It had to be done on the cheap. All I could do.
Spacemen, but they weren't new.
They had to use all recycled parts except for maybe just a new head or a small little accessory or something.
Okay.
So they were variations on what existed.
Within a parameter.
Done on the cheap, done on the cheap.
I understand. Okay.
So if you could do just a new head and out of that derive a new figure, that helped even when the Four Horsemen were doing it. But Gary continued it. That's, my dear, sort of what happened with the Four Horsemen, but this has given me extended my ability to do at least something creative in the interim. And then working with the Four Horsemen, when they first started out, they wanted to do all the photographic backgrounds. And I said, why don't you just let me do them for you? And no, they wanted to do them themselves. So they came up with, this was another point of contention, they came up with an Astronautilus that looked like just exactly what it was. Some aquarium supplies they bought on Canal Street. Little plastic piece of greenery and a piece of orange coral. And then they came up with Metamorpho, who looked like he was standing in the back room at Radio Shack. So they finally agreed to let me do the background. So then I got into, doing all computerized backgrounds and did all the scenery and stuff for the packages. And that was fun. So it was not a marriage made in heaven, but in the end, I think the figures that they did are just about as damn good as you could possibly do them. And
they got done in the end.
And they got done. Not what it could have been if they hadn't taken on Power Lords and did Outer Spacemen with the gusto. We could have continued on endlessly.
So you really took the action figure, and evolved it with the accessories, with the fantasy aspect and the creativity, and also the mechanics of a lot of things.
Well, yeah, those were all ideas that to me weren't that unusual, because a figure that changed faces. Well, there'd been dolls in the 18th century that did that, and I knew all this because I knew toy history. So these weren't so cutting edge for me; they were just natural extension. If Series 2 had to be better than Series 1, so. And throughout all this, I was totally ignorant. I had no idea that I was, in any sense, making anything important. I was only trying to make a toy that would succeed.
But also something you were excited about.
Something I have to say, I put my heart and soul into these. It wasn't just doing it for money. It was doing it for the love of it, for the love of doing it, and for the it was very, very nice, but I never thought it was important. Mm-hmm. And again, I tell you, I never gave it a second thought. Action figures came and filled the stores, and I never even paid any attention to them. I never once said, oh, well, look where Outer Spacemen have gone now. Didn't even occur to me. I didn't think that way. I was too busy trying to come up with something else. And I was working at Color Forms, working on the new toys and whatever. Mm-hmm. And Eric, as you well know, throughout all this, my heart and soul was in collecting. Not in the toys I made. And even today, this is amazing. I like to look at these, but most of the things I did, I don't look at. It was all about the collecting.
Yeah. All action figures come with some kind of a mechanic now. They all come with an accessory. Yeah. They're all very heavy, fantasy. You don't just get like a guy. You can't really just.
No, and they're also all for adults.
Yeah, some of them anyway. Yeah. That's amazing to me that held for that many years. that many decades.
Well, what amazes me is that for all many centuries they didn't exist.
Yeah.
That's pretty incredible. They did not exist. I grew up playing with lead soldiers, all based on World War II.
Well, the technology probably wasn't there.
Of course the technology wasn't there, and nobody would even dream of thinking of making what the New York Times called basically dolls for boys. I mean, that was not a thing you would, I'm sure, yeah, if I was to do a line of action figures now, I'll probably have to call them the Trans Troop or something. They come in 50 varieties, each with...
Don't put my name on this video. I don't want to be on this one. That's all your comments, that's not me.
Oh, I do a figure called Pronoun Plus. Oh God. Well, I think my little figure here of terra firma doesn't leave much to the imagination.
No.
I can't believe that Eric actually did this thing like this and didn't.
Were they 3D printed, or did he actually sculpt them?
The very last ones he did with 3D printing, and he did them with computer sculpting.
Right.
Well, the real problem with this line, and miracle really, and evidence of his incredible prowess, is the fact that he made these all actual size, which is ridiculous. They should have been made upsize and shrunk down. If he had, there'd be a large size line now, but because they're
He did eventually come up with a larger size line.
well, Gary's done this with had it done with the laser scanning, and of course there's that 8-foot monstrosity, which is incredible. That's awesome.
Tell me more about the bigger ones that Gary did. How did those come about?
They came about through the Clutter Gallery here in Beacon. It basically considered art toys.
He had them scanned.
Had them laser scanned. He got a wonderful laser scan artist who enlarged them. Yeah, and they were printed from Eric's original sculptures.
Oh wow! Series 1 and 2?
No, he's only made the one.
Series 1.
He's only made Colossus Rex and another one, Orbitron. Just 2 of them. And along the way, Gary acquired a ownership in a annual event of called 5 Points Festival in Brooklyn.
I heard a lot about that.
Yeah, and that's like all art toys.
Oh, that's Gary, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. It's a pretty big festival.
Yeah, it's really good. Well, he's become part owner of that with the Clutter Gallery. Looking around, I realized that all the things I collected are really images. They're images, they're icons, and they bespeak of a kind of magic. They've all got that element, and they're all just as the symbols. Christ on the crucifix. That's immediately recognizable as an icon in which you impart to it a power and a life force. It's a stand-in for a deity.
Well, as a kid, when you take those figures in your hand, you can travel to that place.
Absolutely.
Be in that world. That's like if I saw the outer spaceman as a kid, I would have been blown away.
Not just the outer spaceman, but the things I collect. These are all icons. They're all related to the gods of ancient Egypt and Greece and all over the world. They've all powerful imagery. And I'm sitting here in this world that's very, very powerful. And that would be the thing, I realize in retrospect. I would look for that life force in these things. And I really kind of think these things have got a little bit of it too. This was one of my lovely paintings. It's actually down the basement now.
What is it of?
It was some very strange clowns, characters against an American flag. Very bizarre. This was the first product I did with Harry, called the Scary Light.
You want to move your T? I'll start running the camera.
Oh, you're running? No, well, we don't have to look at the website through the camera, really. But
I'd like to hear it. What,
So
can you
this-
go up again? What was that?
this was the first thing I did, called the Scary Light. This is actually how I got into toy design.
Love it.
This was it.
Oh, I love it.
Oh, you would love it, actually. You would love this thing.
You don't have any more of them, do you?
I don't have one, but actually, I still have these scraps, and I still have the actual prototype, which is this thing lying right there.
Yeah.
Well, this is the product that got me into toy design. It was amazing. It was as simple as it possibly could be, but it was extremely effective. Are you running the camera? Am I in focus?
Yes,
And- Okay.
Crude as ever.
It was it was nothing more than a flashlight, a cardboard tube with a couple of batteries, a little switch on the end, and on the other end of it was just an inked-in picture of a skeleton, very much like that one in that book
Okay.
that we did last, very much like that, but a little inked drawing of a skeleton doing that.
Cool.
And it
That's
was
on the lens of the.
it was just a piece of
Flashlight.
acetate stuck over the bulb, but the bulb was one of those bulbs with a little lens-like thing on the end of it, you know, and it produced an amazing image of a ghost or a skeleton. Actually, I'm not sure it was a skeleton.
So this product actually did.
It was sort of a ghost something. Well, it sort of came out. It was sort of a ghost something like that. I still have that, and I still have the little piece of thing on it somewhere around here. And I can't tell you how great it worked, because the bulb was distorted. And so when you rotated the tube, the image, like the ghost, would gyrate. And when you telescoped the tube, it was one inside the other, the image would get quite small. So you could take this in a darkened room, and this ghost would appear, and if you're turning the end, it's gyrating like this. And if you push the tube in, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it fills the entire wall.
Cool.
So it was very, very scary and very effective.
How do you mean that it came out kind of? What's that mean?
Well, it kind of got produced and it kind of didn't. Okay. Now then, my idea, so this is what I made. I made this.
Right.
And in the drawings for how I thought it should look, I thought it should have a skull on the end of it to hold the different pictures. So you can take the skull off and you can change the pictures to a lot of different spooky images. And we called it Scary Light. So Harry hired someone to sculpt a skull. This is exactly how I got into toy design. Exactly. That was a simple three-step process. Hired someone to do the skull. By the way, sitting over there is one of the skulls as they ended up.
Oh.
On that thing there was a little kaleidoscope. That goes all the way back, oh my God, to my first days with color forms. First days with Harry.
Cool.
Well, the guy came up with this skull, and it was so horrible. Made of plaster, a prototype was horrible. And I said, well, Harry said to me, can you make a skull? I said, no, I couldn't do that. Then I saw that thing. I said, this is terrible. This guy does this for a living? I can do better than that. So I did a skull. Great. Harry got it molded, and we made up prototypes, and then we packaged, looked something like that, wrapped it in bones like that. Then he hired someone to do a package for it, and the package was so horrible. And Harry thought it was horrible. I thought it was horrible. I said, that guy does that for a living? I said, I can do better than that. I can't design a package, but I can do a better package than that. So I did the package. And that, my dear, is how I got into toy design. Through that simple three-step process of I can't do it, but I can do a better job than that. At any rate, this was So Harry didn't have a showroom, didn't have nothing. He had a job. He had somebody who was selling for him. It wasn't even his sales manager. He didn't have any. He just had a sales rep, and he put his product in a sales room. And I went and saw it at Toy Fair. It was this tiny, tiny little room, and the scary lights were down on a shelf in the back room on the bottom shelf. Well, I told Harry, because Harry couldn't see this for himself. So I reported what was going on there, and Harry blew his top, and that was that. But this guy wasn't going to sell any scary lights, and so the thing never got off first base. It ended up having a chance to be a Batman shadow light, which is up there.
Yeah.
And then it had a chance and was actually manufactured as a Green Hornet signal light. So the idea kind of still happened,
Okay.
in a certain sense.
But these guys were never, like, I'll never find one of these on eBay.
No, they don't exist. Everything that exists is right in this
Oh, what a
photograph.
shame.
And they're in boxes somewhere under the floor.
Oh, what a shame.
But this is really how it all began. My career in toy industry. And that's what we did. I would come up with some little gadget like that, make some little thing like that, and then if it was going to turn into a toy, someone else did the rest of the work. Here's another thing that actually did happen. This was called the Finger of Fate. And this hand suspended in this globe was held aloft by a reverse magnet. So it was a magnet in the hand, a magnet in the base. This was on a very thin thread, but it didn't just hang like that, it hangs suspended like that. So when you put your fingers on the rim, it was a Ouija board.
Oh,
The hand would swing around and land on a letter or a,
cool.
so it was a Bill Basso did this package.
And those were available? Or
Those
were
actually happened. I have one. It's sitting right over there on the top of, sitting on top of the Invasion Earth. So that's the kind of things Harry and I did
Cool.
together that worked or didn't work.
And a lot of these ideas are from older toys.
No, that was
No?
original,
That's
Bobby.
an original idea. Oh.
Was an original idea.
Cool.
This was the origin of Commander Comet.
Ah.
Here's it. This is where I was getting from. The man from Planet X was Electron, right there.
Cool.
This is it, the source of my inspiration. This Metaluna monster was Orbitron. These are the actual famous monsters of Filmland
Oh,
magazines. I got
Well,
this
they were
imagery
yellow
from.
pages.
Yeah. Okay, here was the origin of this guy. Was this thing right here? An image this big. But this was from a film. Forget what it was. Okay. This is it, basically. This is the incident I'm going to tell you about.
Okay. The spray paint can?
Yeah, the spray paint cans. And I reenacted this.
Okay.
But this took place, this was part of the second series, and it was basically this figure. And the figures all had to be posed. This is one of the figures that was stolen. The figures had to be molded with their hands outstretched, because when they're made, a straight wire would be put from across their chest into both the hands, and then they became bendable. And then the legs had to fan out this way, so they could put an L-shaped thing in there. So basically, to illustrate it with this, it would be posed like that.
Got it.
It was basically this figure, and I was just at the point of completing it. I'd worked on this thing in the clay and what do you call it? The plaster I was using. Let me think.
Hydrocal?
You got it, Bubby. You got it. Thank you, Hydrocal. And I had spent a week on this thing, and I had it to absolute perfection, but I had to do it in pieces because it didn't have the wherewithal to hold together while you're working on it. And the glue that I used to glue the brass joints to the legs was Duco cement. Have you ever encountered that? It was a commercial predecessor to airplane cement. It takes I think a good hour to dry properly. And if this thing was balanced perfectly, it would stand on its 2 feet, even though they were turned sideways. But the slightest vibration of the table, or my table was a sawhorse on 2 sawhorses and an old wooden door, and the floor of the loft was, vibrated. So I set this thing so precious to me, all the work that went into this. I posed it on the table with the wet Duco cement in the leg joints, in the hip joints, and I set various objects, just almost touching it, not quite. I wanted them not to really touch it because I didn't want to cheat it and not have it posed perfectly balanced. But I also wanted something to catch it if it should topple over. So I got a series of cans and spray cans and jars, and I set them just so nothing was touching, but just like that. And then I very, very carefully tiptoed away, and the phone rang, and I tiptoed practically down to the far end of the loft, which was 80 feet away. Talked on the phone for half an hour. Came walking back to this thing, and every single one of these jars had moved. And sort of like this. Is this going to move? Yeah, like that.
Whoa.
This is what I saw. The thing was still balanced, but all the jars had moved equidistant away from the thing. It couldn't, what was it? Was it supernatural? Was it by intense anxiety about this thing tipping? Did these objects move through telekinesis? Something moved them. And I have to tell you, Eric, when something like that happens, it doesn't have to be spectacular. You see a horror movie, and the bigger, scarier the monster that crashes through the window is, the more effective it is. But when something just as simple as this really happens in what we consider to be the real world, it's absolutely spine-chilling. You have no idea how utterly frightening that really is. That's,
how did he stay? Did he hold the pose?
It didn't fall.
Mm-hmm. So you got the pose in the end.
Oh, in the end, the glue worked fine. But there was no way in my wildest fantasy, if I had suddenly gone crazy and unbeknownst to myself, unconsciously, had crept up to the other end of the loft. By the way, this was always in full sight. I could see the whole vastness of the unbroken space of the loft. I mean, I was the only one there.
They didn't witness it moving.
Didn't see a thing, no. Didn't see a thing. I didn't see it move. But there was no way I would have let this happen in any way, shape, or form.
Wow. That's cool. Now, which in your mind was the bigger experience? That or seeing what you saw in the sky? Which made more of an impact?
Well, they were very different.
Yeah.
They would both produce that spine-chilling feeling. That, like the monkey thing. I can think of three episodes in my life, and those would be those episodes.
Yeah.
But when you're witnessing this, you just know it. The simplest little thing. I mean, if we were sitting here right now, and one of these figures moved, you would get a feeling like you probably had never experienced before.
I'll be sleeping in Connecticut.
Well, you can take this to bed with you if you want, if you can't feel any safer. That was my. But that was all part of this total, infinite possibility that anything was possible with these outer spacemen. I really did have the feeling there was something there that was something about it. Yeah, something, and I knew they were going to be successful. I didn't have the slightest doubt. Of course, it couldn't preview what actually did happen, but I felt very secure about them. Anyway, that's the story, Bobby. And if the camera's running, what else can I tell you about?